The wine glass shattered against the marble like a gunshot, and for one suspended heartbeat, every conversation in the Bellini ballroom died. Rosa Marchetti stared at the crimson spreading across the front of Giovanni Bellini's $3,000 shirt, and she knew with the colroquetida of someone who had learned exactly how cruel the world could be that her night was about to become a nightmare. "I'm sorry," she said, not a whisper. She had trained herself, over years of serving rich men their dinners, never to let them hear her voice shake. She dropped to her knees and began gathering the broken crystal into the folds of her napkin, and she counted the pieces, because counting was a thing she could control, and control was the only weapon a woman like her had ever been allowed to carry. The man above her did not move. She could feel him looking down at her, and even without lifting her eyes, she understood that the temperature in the room had changed. 200 of New York's most powerful people had all turned to watch, waiting, the way people wait at the edge of something violent. "Look at me," said Giovanni Bellini. His voice was quiet. That was the first thing she noticed. Not a shout, not a snarl, but quiet. The voice of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise it to be obeyed. Rosa lifted her chin. He was younger than the stories made him sound. Perhaps 35, with dark hair swept back from a face carved out of granite and shadow, and eyes so pale a gray they seemed almost silver in the chandelier light. Beautiful, in the way a drawn blade is beautiful. And behind those cold eyes, she saw it the tiny flicker of surprise that she had looked at him at all. She had spent her whole life learning to read the faces of dangerous men. It was how girls like her survived. And what she read in his was not cruelty, exactly. It was boredom. A man so numb to his own power that hurting people had stopped meaning anything. That, she thought, was worse. "Do you know how much this shirt costs?" he said. "More than I make in a month." She kept her eyes on his. "I'll pay for it anyway, however long it takes." A soft, humorless laugh moved through the crowd, and then his uncle stepped forward. Rosa didn't know the man's name yet. She only knew he moved like he owned everything he looked at, silver-haired, with the same pale eyes as the younger man, but none of the stillness. His were restless, hungry, and when they landed on her, they did something she recognized instantly. A slow appraisal that stripped and dismissed her in the same motion. "The catering company should be more careful about who they send," the uncle said, amused. "This one's clumsy." And his gaze traveled the length of her body, cruel, not exactly decorative. The laughter came again, louder. Rosa felt it land on her like stones. She was aware, suddenly and completely, of her body, of the black uniform straining at her hips, of the way she took up more space in this room of starved, glittering women than any of them thought a servant had the right to. Her cheeks burned. But she had been laughed at before, by landlords, by debt collectors who smiled while they emptied her accounts, by men who thought a soft body meant a soft spine. She did not look away. The uncle's smile thinned. He had expected her to flinch, and she hadn't, and it plainly irritated him. He turned to the crowd, spreading his arms like a showman. "Come, Giovanni, give the girl a chance to earn forgiveness, some entertainment." And Giovanni, who had been watching Rosa with that unreadable, glacial stare, said the words that would change everything. "There's a piano," he said, gesturing lazily toward the black grand gleaming beneath a fresco of falling angels. "My accompanist knows every aria ever written. Sing it well enough that I forget my ruined shirt, and I'll marry you." The ballroom erupted. It was the funniest thing they'd heard all season. The women laughed behind jeweled fingers. The men laughed openly. Someone applauded. "And if she fails?" the uncle called, delighted. Giovanni's silver eyes never left her face. Then she leaves, and she never enters this world again. He expected her to cry. She could see it in the bored curl of his mouth. He'd already, in his mind, moved on. She was nothing to him, a stain to be wiped away and forgotten by morning. Rosa rose slowly to her feet. She thought of her father, of his hands on the keys in their tiny apartment, of the way he used to say, "The voice is the only thing they can never repossess," to sorrow. "It lives inside you. No one can take it." She thought of the conservatory, of the debt that swallowed her whole, of the years she had spent silencing the one thing that had ever made her feel like more than a body to be laughed at. She had promised herself she would never sing for people like these. But she looked at Giovanni Bellini, at a man who had never once in his life been surprised, and something older than her pride rose up in her. "What aria," she said, "would you like?" The laughter faltered. Something shifted in his expression, the smallest crack, the barest tightening around the eyes. He hadn't expected the question. He hadn't expected her voice to come out level and clear, without a tremor. The accompanist, an old man with white hair who had been half dozing at the bench all evening, sat up straight. He was staring at her now, really staring. His face had gone pale, as though he were looking at a ghost. Giovanni recovered. "Oh mio bambino caro," he said a soprano's aria, demanding, exposing, chosen to humiliate. "Play it, maestro." But the accompanist did not move. He was staring at Rosa, his lips parted, and in a whisper only she was close enough to hear, he breathed a single word. "Rosa." She went very still. She knew that voice. Buried under 20 years of grief and silence, she knew it. And when she finally looked, truly looked, at the old man's face, her whole carefully built world tilted on its axis. "Maestro Fontana," she whispered. Her teacher, the man who had discovered her at 11, who had trained her voice at the conservatory, who had wept the day she walked away from it, the man who had known her father. He gave the smallest shake of his head, "Not here." "Say nothing," and turned to the keys. His hands were trembling. Then he began to play. Rosa closed her eyes. She let the world fall away, the sneering crowd, the ruined shirt, the beautiful, cruel man with his verdict already written. She reached down into the place inside her that no debt collector, no landlord, no jeering socialite had ever been able to touch. And she opened her mouth. The first note left her like a bird released after 20 years in a cage. It was pure, effortless. It rose into the vaulted ceiling and hung there, shimmering, and every glass in the room stopped halfway to every mouth. "Oh mio bambino caro, oh my dear papa." The sound poured out of her, rich, aching, impossibly controlled, a voice trained in the great halls of Europe. It filled the corners of the room. It climbed the walls. It made the crystals of the chandeliers tremble. No one was laughing now. A woman in the front row pressed a hand to her mouth. A senator set down his drink without looking at it. The uncle stood frozen, the smug amusement draining out of his face like water through his fingers. And Giovanni Bellini did not move at all. He stood in the center of his own ballroom and watched the woman he had tried to destroy transform into something luminous, something untouchable, and for the first time in more years than he could remember, the most dangerous man in New York felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Rosa opened her eyes on the final phrase and looked directly at him as she sang it, not in defiance, not in triumph, but with something raw that stripped him bare. She sang about her father, about love and longing. And though not one aristocrat in that room spoke Italian well enough to follow every word, they understood it, in their spines, in the sudden, unwelcome sting behind their eyes. The last note faded. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then old Fontana lowered his head over the keys, and Rosa saw that he was weeping. The silence broke like a dam. Applause, real, thunderous, helpless, crashed through the ballroom. People rose to their feet. The entire glittering machinery of New York's elite, gathered to watch a servant humiliated, found itself instead on its feet, applauding a queen. Rosa stood in the center of it all, trembling, and looked at the only person not clapping. Giovanni was staring at her, the way a man stares at the thing that has just undone him. Slowly, very slowly, he lowered his crystal glass to a passing tray. He crossed the floor toward her, the crowd parting before him, and he stopped so close she could feel the heat off his body, and he said, in a voice pitched only for her, "Who are you?" And Rosa, because she had learned that the moment you let a powerful man see your fear was the moment you lost, lifted her chin and answered, "I'm the waitress you just promised to marry." He did not let her leave that night, but neither did he keep the promise, and Rosa did not expect him to. Men like Giovanni Bellini did not marry women who carried trays. What he did instead was more dangerous. He kept her, not as a wife, as a question he could not stop asking. He installed her in a guest suite on the 3rd floor of the Bellini mansion, with a view of the East River, and when she demanded to know why, he said only that people had begun asking about her, his uncle's people, and until he understood why a catering waitress had a conservatory voice and a name that made old Fontana weep, She was safer inside these walls than out. "And if I refuse to stay?" she asked. "You won't. You don't know that." "No," he agreed, and something almost like curiosity crossed his face. "I don't. That's new." She learned, over the weeks that followed, that captivity in a mansion was still captivity. But she also learned that Giovanni Bellini was not the man she'd met in the ballroom. That man had been armor. This one, the one she caught glimpses of in the long, strange season she spent inside his house, was something else entirely. She saw him standing alone at the tall windows at 3 a.m, unable to sleep. She saw the way his men flinched when he entered a room, and the way he never once smiled with anything but his mouth. She saw the enormous, aching loneliness of a man who had been raised to feel nothing, and had succeeded so completely that feeling anything at all now frightened him. And she began, tentatively, to sing again. It started with Fontana, who came each afternoon under the cover of tuning the pianos, and who, when the doors were closed and the house was quiet, became her teacher again. He rebuilt her breath. He coaxed the rust from her upper register. And slowly, week by week, the voice she had buried came back to her, and with it came her father, and grief, and something that felt dangerously like joy. Giovanni would stand in the doorway of the music room, unseen, and listen. She always knew when he was there. She could feel him the way you feel, a change in the weather. And one afternoon, mid-phrase, she stopped and turned and caught him, and instead of leaving, as he always did, he stayed. "Don't stop," he said. "Please." It was the please that undid her. She'd never heard him say it before. So they began to talk. It happened slowly, over many nights. The way trust is built, never all at once. They talked about music first, because it was safe. He told her his mother had loved opera, that she had died when he was 9, that the house had been silent ever since. She told him about her father, though not everything, not yet. She told him that a voice could be a prison as easily as a gift, that she had spent years hating hers because it reminded her of everything she'd lost. "Then why did you sing that night?" he asked. "In the ballroom. You could have run." "Because you expected me to run." She looked at him steadily. "And I've spent my whole life doing what men like you expected. Just once. I wanted to see the surprise on your face." He was quiet for a long moment. "You did," he said finally. "See it." And she watched something in him crack open a fraction wider. The change in Giovanni did not come like a lightning strike. It came the way winter breaks into spring imperceptibly, then all at once. She watched a man who had felt nothing for 15 years relearn how to feel, and it terrified him, and he fought it. He would be tender with her for an evening, and then vanish for 3 days, cold as stone, punishing them both for the crime of his own softening. He would find reasons to be near her, and then invent reasons to leave. Once, reaching for the same sheet of music, his hand closed over hers, his thumb resting against the pulse in her wrist, and neither of them moved. And she watched his silver eyes drop to her mouth and darken, and stay there. He pulled back first. "Forgive me," he said roughly, and left, and did not come near her for a week. But she noticed the ledger of small things, the way her favorite tea appeared in the kitchen without her asking, the way the guards, who had first watched her like a prisoner, came to nod at her like family, the way he began, without ever saying so, to arrange the entire rhythm of the great house around the hours she sang. She was falling. She knew it, and she hated that she knew it, because she also knew with the survivor's instinct she had never once been wrong to trust that this beautiful, broken man was hiding something from her about her own life. Something in the way his face had changed when she said her name. Something in the locked door of the basement he had told her never to open. So one night, when the house was asleep, Rosa Marchetti went looking for the truth herself. She did not wait to be told it. She had spent 20 years being handed truths by other people, usually in the form of a bill she couldn't pay. This time she went and found it. The basement door was locked, but Fontana had told her, weeks ago, that the old maestro had once had the run of this house, and that the servant's passage behind the wine cellar had never been sealed. She found it. She descended into the dark with a phone light and a hammering heart, and she found the vault, and inside it 30 years of ledgers, every loan, every ruin, every family the Bellinis had broken to build what they had. And she found, because she went looking specifically for it, the year her father died. She was still on the cold floor, the ledger open in her lap, when the light came on. Giovanni stood at the bottom of the stairs. He did not shout. He did not move to take the book from her. He simply looked at her, and at the open page, and his face, the face that never showed the world anything, was the face of a man watching a door close on the only good thing that had ever happened to him. "You weren't supposed to find that," he said quietly. "No." Her voice was steady, though her hands were not. "I don't imagine I was." "How much did you read?" "Enough." She looked up at him, and for the first time since the ballroom, she let him see how much she was hurting. "My father was your family's accompanist, wasn't he? 20 years ago. He taught you piano when you were a boy." She saw the flinch, small and involuntary, and knew she was right. "And then he saw something, and your family destroyed him for it. Not with a gun, with money. They buried him in debt, ruined his name, made sure no orchestra would ever hire him again. He died of a heart attack at 44, poor and disgraced, and the debt came to me, the debt that took my voice, the debt I've been paying my whole life." Her voice finally broke. "You knew. From the moment I said my name in that ballroom, you knew." "I suspected." Giovanni came down the last stairs and knelt in front of her, slowly, the way a man approaches something wounded. "I confirmed it that first night. And every day since, I have tried to find the courage to tell you, and every day I have failed, because I knew that the moment you understood what my family did to yours, you would look at me the way you're looking at me now." His voice was hoarse. "I didn't do it, Rosa. I was a boy, but I inherited it. I have lived off the money that broke your father. Everything I am was built on your family's ruin, and I cannot ask you to forgive that, because I can't forgive it myself." "Who?" Rosa said. "Who did it?" "A name." Giovanni was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was very low. "My uncle, Salvatore." He looked at her. "Your father saw him kill a man, in the garden, by the fountain. Your father was going to go to the police, so Salvatore destroyed him instead, quietly, thoroughly, the way he destroys everything. And he made sure the debt followed you, because Salvatore doesn't believe in loose ends. He spent 20 years watching your family bleed and calling it prudence." Rosa closed her eyes. She thought she would feel rage. Instead, she felt something colder and clearer, the flat, focused calm she'd learned in 100 rooms full of men who thought her powerless. She had been given, at last, the shape of the thing that had eaten her whole life, and she found that knowing its name did not break her, it steadied her. "Then I want to see him ruined," she said, opening her eyes. "Not dead, ruined. I want him to lose everything, the way my father did, and I want to be the one holding the proof when it happens." Giovanni looked at her for a long, long moment, and then, slowly, the ghost of something that was almost admiration moved across his granite face. "You," he said, "are not what I expected. Not that night, not any night since." "No," Rosa agreed, "I'm not." "The problem," Giovanni explained, "was proof. The ledgers showed the debt, but debt was legal. They showed ruin, but ruin was just business. What they did not show was the murder, the thing Antonio Marchetti had died to expose, because Salvatore was far too careful ever to have written it down." "There's no evidence of the killing," Giovanni said. "There never was. It's why your father had to be silenced with money instead of law. His word against a Bellini's, 20 years gone. There's nothing left to find." But Rosa, who had spent the last hour thinking, disagreed. "There's Fontana," she said. Giovanni frowned. "The maestro? He teaches you scales. He knew my father. He was in this house, in those years. He told me himself that only he ever knew the truth." She leaned forward. "Giovanni, men like your uncle destroy people who threaten them. My father threatened him, so he moved. But he never touched Fontana, never ruined him, never silenced him. Why? Salvatore doesn't leave loose ends. You said so yourself." Understanding dawned slowly in Giovanni's eyes. Because Fontana had something on him. Insurance. A witness protects himself the only way a witness can. He keeps a copy. Rosa's heart was pounding. My father was a moral man, but he wasn't a fool. If he saw a murder, he didn't just decide to go to the police. He'd have made a record first. Written it down, sworn it, given it to the one person he trusted completely to hold if anything happened to him. She looked up. His oldest friend, the man who discovered his daughter, the maestro. They found Fontana the next morning, and when Rosa told the old man what she suspected, he wept for the second time in a month. 20 years, he whispered, his hands shaking. 20 years I've kept it, and I never knew what to do with it. To use it was to die. To destroy it was to betray Antonio. So I hid it, and I waited, and I prayed that God would one day send me a reason. He looked at Rosa, his old eyes streaming, and he sent me you, singing your father's aria in that terrible room. The document was a signed, notarized affidavit in Antonio Marchetti's own hand, an eyewitness account of the murder Salvatore Bellini had committed in the Bellini garden, dated and sworn 2 weeks before Antonio's ruin began. It named the victim. It described the disposal. It was everything the FBI had never had. And it was real, not a convenient page in a burning ledger, a dying man's testimony, hidden for 20 years by the one person the killer had been too arrogant to fear. This, Giovanni said quietly, holding it, ends him. This, Rosa corrected, is mine to use. Not yours. Mine. She took it back from his hands, gently but completely. You gave me the name Giovanni. I'll finish it. Salvatore Bellini found out 3 days later. He was not a stupid man, that was what made him dangerous. He had noticed the shift in the house, the way his nephew had softened, the way the waitress had stopped being furniture and started being watched. And when one of his own men reported that old Fontana had been meeting privately with the girl, Salvatore did the arithmetic in a single cold instant, and he moved. They took Rosa from the third-floor suite in the black hours before dawn. But Rosa Marchetti had spent her whole life being taken from of money, of choices, of her voice, of her father, and she had promised herself, on the cold basement floor 3 nights ago, that she would never again be a thing that simply happened. So she had prepared. The affidavit was not on her. It was not in the house. She had given the original to Fontana to place, that very afternoon, into the hands of a federal prosecutor. Giovanni had quietly contacted a woman who had been building a case against the Bellinis for years and had never had a witness who lived. By the time Salvatore's men dragged Rosa into the SUV, the wheels were already turning miles away. What Salvatore had was a hostage. What he did not know was that he had already lost. They took her to a warehouse at the harbor, and Salvatore came to her himself, and Rosa, bound to a chair in the cold, salt-smelling dark, looked up at the man who had killed her father and felt, to her own surprise, no fear at all. "You have your father's eyes," Salvatore said. He said it almost gently. "I remember him. A talented man, a good man." He crouched to her level. "Do you know what good men never understand? That someone has to do the ugly things. This family was drowning when I was young. My brother was soft, sentimental. He'd have let it all collapse. I held it together. Every terrible thing I ever did, I did so that the people I loved could sleep in warm beds and call themselves respectable and never know the cost." His pale eyes were terribly sincere. "Your father was going to bring it all down over a matter of conscience. One man's conscience against the survival of everyone I was sworn to protect. What would you have chosen in my place?" And Rosa understood, then, the true horror of him, not that he was evil, but that he believed, completely, that he was good. That he had cast himself as the tragic hero of a story where her father was the reckless fool and she was a loose end, and he would go to his grave certain he'd been the only adult in a house full of children. "I would have chosen," Rosa said, "not to build a family on other people's graves and call the graves love." She held his gaze. "You didn't protect anyone, Salvatore. You just needed a beautiful word for what you already wanted to do." Something flickered in his face, the first genuine crack she'd seen, a flash of a wound so old and so defended that even he had forgotten it was there. "You have until dawn to decide to be reasonable," he said, standing, the armor sliding back into place. "Tell me where Fontana hid whatever he's been keeping, and this ends quickly." "He hid it," Rosa said calmly. "Somewhere you'll see it very soon." She was buying time. She knew, from the way his men kept checking their phones, from the tension climbing in the room, that word was spreading. She kept Salvatore talking about her father, about the old days, about the family he claimed to love, because every minute she kept him circling his own justifications was a minute closer to dawn, and dawn, she was certain, was coming for him. The warehouse doors blew open at 5:40 the morning. But it was not Giovanni who came through them first. It was the federal prosecutor and 30 agents, and the flashing blue and red of a dozen vehicles sweeping across the rain because Rosa had not waited to be rescued. She had made sure the proof was already moving before she was ever taken, and the affidavit had done in 3 days what 20 years of investigation could not. Salvatore Bellini's men scattered. Salvatore himself stood frozen in the center of the warehouse, and for the first time Rosa saw the mask fall away completely, and beneath it was not a monster but a frightened old man who had spent his whole life terrified of the collapse he'd committed every sin to prevent and who had, in the end, caused it himself. Giovanni came through the doors moments later, and he crossed the warehouse to Rosa at a dead run, and he was on his knees in front of her, his hands frantic on the ropes, on her face, her hair. "I've got you," he was saying over and over. "I've got you, Rosa. You're safe." "I know," she said, and she was almost smiling. "I had it handled. You're late." He let out a broken sound that was half a sob and half a laugh, and pressed his forehead to hers, and did not let go. They took Salvatore Bellini away in handcuffs as the sun came up over the harbor. Antonio Marchetti's affidavit, 20 years buried, was enough, and once the prosecutor had a living thread to pull, the rest unraveled fast. The murder, the cover-up, 4 decades of Bellini crimes that Salvatore had believed himself too clever ever to answer for. Giovanni was not arrested that morning, but he could have run, could have used his money and his name to bury the whole thing, protect the empire, walk away clean. He didn't. He walked into the prosecutor's office of his own free will, and he handed over everything, the ledgers, the accounts, the entire poisoned architecture of the family his father had built, and he testified. He gave up the mansion, the money, the name that had terrified a city. By the time the courts were finished, Giovanni Bellini was, by every measure the world understood, a ruined man. He served 14 months. His cooperation dismantled what remained of the empire, and the sentence was far lighter than his family's crimes deserved. But he served it, and he did not complain, because he told Rosa, through the glass, on one of her many visits for the first time in his life he felt clean. Rosa used those 14 months, too. Free at last from the engineered debt that had died with Salvatore's empire, she did the one thing she had sworn she never could again. She auditioned. And a small, serious opera company heard the daughter of Antonio Marchetti sing O mio babbino caro, and they wept, exactly as a ballroom of aristocrats had wept, and they gave her a contract. She did not wait at any prison gate for Giovanni to complete her. She built her own life first, her career, her voice, her name restored so that when he walked out into the gray light of a Boston autumn, she came to him not as a woman who had been rescued, but as a woman who had chosen. He saw her at the gate, and he stopped, and something broke open in his face. "You waited," he said. "No," Rosa corrected gently, taking his hands. "I lived, and then I chose to be here." She smiled up at him. "There's a difference. I needed you to understand the difference." "I have nothing," he said. "No money, no name, nothing to offer you." She pressed his hand flat against her own heart. "You have a voice inside you," she said softly, "that no one can ever repossess. My father used to say that. It lives inside you, and no one can take it." Her eyes were shining. "You gave me back my song, Giovanni, but you didn't rescue me. You just stopped being one of the things I had to survive. That's better. That's the only kind of love I'd ever have said yes to." 8 months later, in a small candlelit church in Boston, they were married. There were no black SUVs, no aristocrats, no 200 glittering guests waiting to laugh. There was only Maestro Fontana at a modest organ, a handful of friends, and rain streaking the stained glass windows in ribbons of colored light. Rosa wore no wine-stained uniform now. She wore white, and she carried her father's photograph tucked against the flowers in her hands. And when the old maestro began to play, she looked at the man waiting at the altar, a man the whole city had once feared, who had given up everything to answer for sins he had inherited but never chosen, and she watched him do the thing she had once believed impossible. Giovanni Bellini smiled with his whole face. Before the priest could speak a word, Rosa lifted her voice in the little stone church and sang the aria, their aria, the one that had started it all, not for a room full of people who wanted her to fail, but for the one person who had finally, truly understood what he was hearing. Her voice rose into the rafters, pure and clear and free. And Giovanni watched his bride sing their story into the candlelit air, tears streaming down the face that had once shown the world nothing at all, and he understood, at last, that the cruel, flippant promise he'd made in a gilded ballroom to humiliate a stranger had somehow become the truest words he had ever spoken. "If you can sing this aria, I'll marry you." She had, and this time freely, cleanly, having lost everything and found the only thing that mattered, so did he. And somewhere, Rosa was certain in the colored light, in the swell of the organ, in the sound of a voice, the debt and grief and 20 years of silence had never managed to kill her father, was finally at peace.